Welcome. My name's Christy Bolingbroke. I'm the Executive Artistic Director for the National Center for Choreography at the University of Akron. This evening, we're very excited to bring Pioneer Winter of the Pioneer Winter Dance Collective in Miami, Florida. I wanted to advise you that our dancing conversations are here to locate dance in alternative fields of study. And we're also having these conversations not as a means just to seek answers, but to encourage everyone to keep asking questions when it comes to dance. In introducing Pioneer this evening, I wish to let you know that Pioneer is a Miami-based choreographer and artistic director of Pioneer Winter Collective, a dance theater company rooted in social practice and community, queer visibility, and beauty beyond the mainstream. Recognized in Dance Magazine's 25 to Watch, Pioneer Winter works to democratize performance in public spaces, museums and galleries, stage, and film. Pioneer's work is supported by local, state, and foundation grants and fellowships. And Pioneer is the Arsh Center's first artist in residence in collaboration in a decade. Pioneer earned an MPH in Public Health and Epidemiology from Florida International University's Stemple College of Public Health, and an MFA in choreography from Jacksonville University, White Oak. An extension of his creative practice, Pioneer has curated and directed Screen Dance Miami Festival since 2017, presented first by Tiger Tail Productions and now by a Miami Light Project, as well as screening his own films internationally. Pioneer serves as assistant teaching professor in the Honors College and College of Communication, Architecture and the Arts at Florida International University. Please join me in welcoming Pioneer Winter.
Hey, Christy.
Hey,
Thank you for having me.
We're going to talk a little bit later on how we're excited to be welcoming you to Akron finally this coming December. But to get us started a little bit, let's talk about the intersection of movement as both choreography and socio-political reform, and how you're relating to queer history, dance history, and the current landscape in queer culture or dance.
That's a really big question. I would say that I consider dance to exist in all interactions. I think I see choreography when in commuting to work, transportation. I see choreography at protests and marches. I see choreography even like with social awkwardness, like whether or not you make eye contact with someone or whether or not you approach them, and and how we just how we occupy space together. So I have a really broad definition of what dance is and can be. Like the major objective of like our work is expanding the definition of it so that all bodies thrive, and so that there isn't this erasure present based upon race or body type, age, ability. Like that we don't really go for that in our work, and this goes for both the artists as well as the audience. So in democratizing dance, it's not just like about who the audience is seeing on stage, but also the experience that the artist is getting in doing the work.
Kind of set us on this pathway. We'll be working on your latest piece, Birds of Paradise, together. And I'm curious if you could elaborate a little bit more on how queer identity and representation plays a role in your work.
Yeah, so for the last few pieces, we've had a lot to do with memory and power, agency, relationships, particularly queer ones. The focus of the work has been very autobiographic in nature. Everything has been devised with and for the performers that are inhabiting the dance. And with Birds of Paradise, I think I wanted to try a little bit of a departure from something that was so rooted in the singularity of identity, and instead like explore great queer deeds that are dating like from like Stonewall riots to present day, and that like this would be like this ensemble piece that is meant to explore like coalition and unity and the power of the collective voice. But with the pandemic, it made closeness and intimacy and touch very taboo. And what we found during this continued process, even through the pandemic, working through Zoom, turning our research to discussion, interview, story collection, reflection, we found that isolation, which is like an experience that's very familiar to like the queer community, has now become pervasive in all communities. And with this new context, we are then able to find focus on the individual experiences that lead up to those queer deeds. So like the self-talk, the grip of the hands, like right before they release, the desire to like both revel in your body as well as transform your body, and to be in this constant state of becoming. So we took the original themes of the effort of flight and rebirth and resilience, and the project itself is reborn into a series of solos that are honoring the voice of the individual, and understanding that like that queerness is so expansive that no number of ensemble could ever come close to representing and making visible all those identities. So rather than attempt to generalize, instead it was about celebrating that which can't be defined.
Well, and you hinted at it a little bit by using the word flight, but could you tell us a little bit more, like why Birds of Paradise?
Uh,
Or
Birds
just
of
why
Paradise,
birds?
yeah. I mean, birds are like the who hasn't had a rough day and looked at a bird and wished that they were that bird for a second, you know? Like they're a symbol of freedom. With the Bird of Paradise in particular, I wanted to like the idea of the phoenix, and you know, which is like this another like mythical creature that can rebirth from the ashes, and this idea of like immortality and healing. I wanted to see like, well, what would be the queer response to the phoenix? And we're in Miami, very tropical. You know, certainly not New Guinea, which is like the where most birds of paradise are found. But there are 42 different types, and you know, no single bird of paradise looks like the other. I made sure that we didn't approach the bird of paradise as something that we were trying to represent or illustrate, but rather using this idea of the bird of paradise as an avatar for exploring exploring tough things in each solo, within and between ourselves, so that the bird of paradise becomes this representation of wholeness that is possible, but it also requires many tiny breaks along the way. And you know, so it brings us to this idea of resilience and how it's just been romanticized, especially in the past few years. Like it's become, you know, and particularly the past year, how it's just become like, since when is someone's survival about inspiring someone else? Right. And yeah, so it just opened up so many more possibilities. So it's really been we've been trying to find the silver lining in our reality.
You laid down so much there. I mean, part of it certainly is that the what did you say, 42 different unique species of birds of paradise. So
Yes.
something that's expansive, something that doesn't homogenize, that individuality is really appealing and interesting. But then also the very notion of the phoenix, that idea of transformation and rebirth, it makes me think of another singular idea sometimes that people may have about queer culture. And that is like, maybe they have very limited exposure or information. Maybe they only watch RuPaul's Drag Race on TV, and not every queer person is a drag queen or king. So I'm curious, that idea of transformation, either through costuming or through drag culture, is that something that we can expect to see inside of this work?
Well, that's really interesting that you asked that, because originally drag and pageantry and uh, uh, assemblage was a very big part of the work, but there's actually been like a de-pageanting that has happened. There are two performers in the cast that are drag artists, but neither of them are performing in drag. They're performing as themselves. And I believe for both of them, this is like the first time that they've been able to do that, where they are performing themselves in the most authentic way possible without having to use a facade or
A mask.
a mask, an avatar of entertainment, in order to do that. So I mean, they're incredibly brave and powerful performers, and I'm just really happy that they're able to try something new with this project.
That is fantastic. Thank you for sharing. And we have a special treat tonight. We're going to watch a couple different clips from some of your later work. But right now, you're going to share a early clip, a rough cut, the beginning of one of the solos from Birds of Paradise. And this is Shamar, and we're going to go ahead and let it roll. And Pai's going to talk over it and tell us more about what we're seeing.
Yeah, so one of the unexpected beautiful things that came from the pandemic was the opportunity to reconnect with this performer, Shamar Watt. I actually met Shamar in 2012 at Miami-Dade College through a residency. It was like one of my first times choreographing, and I was given an opportunity by his then teacher, Michelle Grant Murray, and that's how I met Shamar. And because of the pandemic, Shamar came back to Miami, and I was able to begin working with him. So Shamar is a movement and sound artist, born in Kingston, Jamaica, raised in Miami. He's driven by the sciences and languages of God and how they translate through movement and sound. So we started off thinking about the where Shamar enters the space, the questioning. The film will feature Shamar's voice, Shamar's heartbeat, and we use light in order to create a subtext for the myth of Icarus, which is a questioning of how close to the sun can we go without falling apart, and is that real? Like, is Icarus maybe just a pushback against ambition to keep someone from striving? Shamar entered the space very interested about the queering of space, how isolation and solitude are now felt by all, and queering a space, existing in a space as a Black man, and the undue harshness and the unoccupiable nature of that space that's felt. with this story of Icarus, there's also a questioning of whether or not the sun is the only source of knowledge. Is the sun the only thing that that will grant us that radiance? And so his solo is also about cultivating an inner radiance, questioning, recognizing that light, and within that light, that rather than it just being the sun that's the only source, that there's more, and that there's this idea that if we aren't successful, if we fail, then nothing has been accomplished. But effort will touch the sun. Effort will touch the sun even if the physical being doesn't. So Shamar solo is really looking at the effort of flight, the effort of occupying a space that is unhospitable, and carving out that space for himself. We also played with preconceived notions of the masculine and feminine, and how to separate one from the other is just so impossible. And seeing how they collapse into one body, seeing how the divine feminine and the divine masculine are used for strength and resilience and rebirth, using the story of Icarus as like this allegory to question, this myth to question, while at the same time Shamar is remaking his own myth.
I love you also brought like so much into that, and yet Icarus, another story about flight, and is that a forewarning tale to dampen ambition. There's a leader that I appreciate who often will say that the why is what allows us to fly, and it gives me so much to think about, and I can't wait to see the finished piece with Shamar.
We can't wait to share it. It's going to be amazing.
It'll be so great. I really appreciate you showing this little snippet. We are going to continue with some invited guest speakers from our community here in Akron this evening that's going to offer their own reflections to some of your earlier work. But Pi, thank you so much for joining us. All right, more soon. Absolutely.
Have fun.
That was Pioneer Winter. We were in conversation about his latest new work, Birds of Paradise, and he gave us a sneak peek with an early rough cut of a film featuring Shamar Watt, one of his dancers. And for the rest of this evening, we've also shared this material with some of our guest thinkers and speakers here in Akron to reflect on their viewing and interpretation and perspective that they bring when watching Pioneer's work. So first up, Latonda Mobley from here in Akron, Ohio. Latonda currently functions as the operations manager for Block by Block, provides support to the downtown neighborhood by way of Downtown Akron Partnership. Ms. Mobley comes to Akron from Columbus, Ohio, where she worked in sales and account management for Cardinal Health. Tonda, as she is known by most, passionately believes that inclusion begins with a smile. This belief guides her work as a member of the Akron Pride Festival Steering Committee and chair of the Cultural Humility Subcommittee, as well as serving on the board of the directors for Canopy. In her spare time, Tonda enjoys urban ballroom and line dancing, singing off-key karaoke, and ensuring that the Cleveland Dog Pound is as rowdy as possible. Latonda Mobley, Tonda,
hey.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Welcome to Dance. Welcome to NCCAkron.
Thank you for having me. I'm so honored to be here.
Oh my goodness. So I would love to hear, what did you notice in watching the Shamar solo by Pioneer?
I thought it was so powerful. It made me tingle to think of the message therein, when we're talking about the power of the sun and the authenticity of that power, is it actual power? It's interesting to me that he's dancing in the dark. Because I don't necessarily ascribe to the fact that things that are dark are necessarily bad, scary, or evil. They're just unknown. And a lot of strength is built in the shadows. A lot of our male dancers who have found acceptance in the shadows of dance. And our African American dancers especially, who have had the challenges of being included in certain dance arenas, have found their strength in those shadows and are now shining very much like the dancer did in his performance. I loved it.
That is an amazing point about like the power and politics of the dancing black body. That's a big piece of it. And you and I were actually talking about where the Akron Pride Festival has come along in embracing some of this intersectionality. So how did Pioneer's work reflect or resonate with the work that you've been doing for this year's Pride Festival that's coming up?
Well, I think that I've been doing is a huge overstatement. There's a whole committee.
Yes, it takes a village.
My gosh, and so I cannot take credit for the work of the steering committee. They've done an amazing job, and this year, kudos to both sides. Akron has historically, for the past few years, pre-COVID, had two separate Pride festivals, one for Family Black Pride and one for the Akron Pride Festival.
Okay.
They have chosen to take the challenges of the past, be honest and open about them, drudge through the hurt that is there on both sides of the fence, because discrimination hurts everyone. And they've taken the time to really dig into that fight together, and now move forward. And for the first time ever, Family Black Pride and the Akron Pride Festival Steering Committee are working together in support of each other's events. They're still two events, but they're working well together on both sides. I love it.
Well, we don't have to just celebrate one day. We can celebrate multiple days and events.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's
Continue
really great.
The party. I love it. And acknowledging the challenge and pain that to have an intersectional future, we have to acknowledge where we were not so connected in the past, because that is a part of the history, which also relates a little bit to Pioneer's work and his own research, looking at past queer political movements, looking at Stonewall, understanding what it was to be queer previously. And I think that historical line, right, just because someone may come out today or this year doesn't mean that they're also starting at zero, because they're part of a long lineage themselves, for better or worse.
Agreed, agreed.
And so, do you have any questions that you would want to voice for Pioneer? Anything that came up in watching this work?
I didn't have any questions. What it did was it sparked such an emotion in thinking about the ways that dance halls, dance studios have been safe havens for our dancers, especially are Black dancers. When we think of being African American in the USA, there's a lot of spaces where we've always kind of felt condemned to inferiority. And when you have that space in a dance setting, you no longer are condemned in that way. You have the freedom of expression and individuality, and for our men, even more so, because for reasons that I believe are based on a patriarchal society that hypersexualizes women.
I don't think you're alone in that belief.
Lesbians are, feminine lesbians are more widely accepted, and our men are emasculated for whom they love. And so the dancing opens up the door for that, very much like hip hop did for our masculine sisters. And they now have a stage, all of them, where they can stand hand in hand with our white brothers and sisters and our allies, and all understand that we're singing the same song and dancing to the same beats. I love that. And so I think it's really amazing that Pi came forward to kind of express that through these series of dances.
Yeah, no, that's so great to be able to point it out, because we often talk about the value of arts and culture as it's a form of personal expression, which makes it almost sound like it's a hobby, but it is actually hugely empowering, and it is a megaphone to amplify that personal expression as well. One last question. It's not in your bio, but I know that we also talked about the makeup arts. So I am curious, given our conversation with Pi about drag culture and transformation, if you had any thoughts or perspective to bring in that regard.
I love what Pi said about the de-dragging. I find that, I tell people all the time when I'm doing their makeup, God has given you everything you need already. I just paint it. And so a lot of times people can't see the inside when they're looking at such a pretty thing on the outside. And kudos to RuPaul, because he's our standard for drag queen greatness. And what he did was went on a separate platform to show that how diverse he was and things that can transfer. And then he unveiled himself in Body Wars so that you can see his God-given face and still recognize the beauty of his talent. And I think makeup does that for a lot of our queens and kings, and even those who don't choose to do the performing arts. It's still kind of a thing so that you can see the beauty on the outside and then recognize the gift on the inside.
And for even maybe some of us civilians to put on a little armor when we need to.
True story. Anytime I want to hide, I do full glam because people will see your eyeshadow before they see your eyes.
I love
so
it.
I get it.
Ampliphone, that's a different kind of megaphone for sure. Tonda, I'm so delighted to get to meet you. Thank you for joining us to come out and talk a little bit about dance.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Latonda Mobley, for joining us for this conversation this evening. And next up, we're going to watch a clip from Pioneer Winter's 2016 piece, Gimpgate. This was a commissioned work by Karen Peterson and dancers. It is a solo for two people between both Pioneer and dancer Marjorie Burnett. And when we come back, Arne Tunstall will discuss what he noticed and sees.
Fuck you. Mind your own fucking business. Put your purpose out.
Reach more. Hand out.
Lean back.
Show your face. Does this hurt? Hold on tight.
Keep up with me.
Are you okay?
Lean back.
Sorry.
Grab my hand. Balance.
Breathe with me.
Wait. Hand. Grab my hand. My leg is stuck.
Hold on tight. Show your face.
That was Gimpgate by Pioneer Winter with Marjorie Burnett, and it premiered in 2016. And next up, I'm very pleased to welcome Arne Tunstall. Prior to becoming the director of University Galleries, Mr. Tunstall worked for the Akron Art Museum in various curatorial positions since 1985 and served as the collections manager and registrar from 1994 to 2016. Select museum projects included curating exhibitions Proof, Danny Lyon's Bike Riders, managing a national tour of the work of sculptor El Anatsui, and managing a multi-year project to digitize the museum collection and to make it available online. Tunstall is also on the board of directors for Akron Soul Train and previously served on the board of directors for Spaces Gallery in Cleveland. He received his Bachelor's of Fine Arts degree from the University of Akron, majoring in graphic design and photography, and he received his Master's of Fine Arts in photography from the Ohio University. Tunstall has also taught as an adjunct professor at the University of Akron in the Myers School of Art, preceding his current work with the Arts Administration graduate program. Tunstall is active throughout the Northeast Ohio region with curatorial projects and continues to create and exhibit his own artwork. Arne, thank you so much for joining us and just talking about dance.
Thank you for having me. I've loved dance for a long time as an audience member, so I'm excited to.
What came up for you in Pioneer's work, I guess most recently Gimpgate, which we just watched?
Watching Gimpgate for me was a real gut punch as an audience member. It was a very visceral response, and especially because it started with that aggressive sort of FU, to the audience, to the camera, and their connection, the two dancers throughout the whole sequence, felt kind conversational, adversarial, and aggressive, and then it turns tender. It was just really remarkable.
Gosh. And then we have this unexpected sort of theme about light and dark that's been coming up this evening, or maybe light versus dark. And I'm really curious, your experience as a photographer, how would you like to chime in? What's resonating for you about that?
Well, looking at this piece, I mean, I noticed the darkness and how the bodies were reacting to the mirror. And for me as a photographer, it's never black or white. It's always black and white. I still shoot film, and the light and dark needs to be in conversation. And I loved Latonda's comments in response to Pioneer's comments about the sun and the light and being in shadow, and how all that sort of is in conversation, and that they need each other. And for me, in this piece in particular, watching those bodies reflected, also because as a photographer, I'm always thinking in the negative or the opposite, or what's behind that thing, and how it's a thin negative or a dense one that's going to be very light or very dark. But also for me, it's so pared down that you really are looking at these bodies and the reactions and what they're doing, and his tenderness toward her. And then also that aggressiveness in there with the like, show me your face, and the directions I thought were at times a kind of, when you see someone who is quote unquote disabled, you want to help them, and this woman clearly was like, she knew what she needed and she was asking for it. That I thought was really empowering and wonderful. Yeah,
I mean the representation is very important in Pioneer's work, and I'm curious, given your own personal experience as a lifelong Akronite, how would you describe or maybe note some of the evolution and changes you've seen in terms of queer visibility and representation in our city and community?
Well, I can say, to my personal experience, visibility was really kind of nil when I was young. At the time when I should have been coming out and discovering myself, it was just sort of, it was not an option, and not really visible to me. And there was no internet to go to. There was no way to find, my tribe, until I found a few, friends in high school, and then in college, of course. But even then, the spaces you were allowed to go to, where the bars were unmarked and in the quiet part of town where you could be unnoticed. And the exciting thing now, especially being back on campus, is noticing that the students that are here now don't need to hide. They can go to bars where they are with all of their friends, queer and otherwise, and just can be themselves. Of course, we're not anywhere near where we need to be, but we are so much closer, and seeing that openness, and also responding to what Latonda's doing with the Pride Fest. I went to it every year that it's happened in the last few years, and it's just remarkable, the families, parents with clearly questioning children and adolescents, seeing their brothers and sisters out there and seeing that they're functional human beings that have jobs and have friends, would have been so wonderful for me to see as a kid. And it just warms my heart that that's happening here in Akron, and it's such a welcoming event. I love it.
Yes. So are there any questions or things that you might want to offer up for consideration for Pioneer or anyone else who's watching this work?
I think for Pioneer's piece that he's showing us and talking about with the bird of paradise and this Shamar character, I don't know how this is going to go. For me, I'm excited to see sort of what happens. I feel like we've gotten sort of this beginning tease of this character in the darkness, and then seeing the costume sort of illuminated. And I really responded to the silhouette, also as a photographer, seeing that sort of negative shape of the body, and that body in that costume also made more sense to me in silhouette than it did when it was lit. My favorite thing when he was in the light was the gold leaf on his body, and sort of seeing that sheen accent the movements. I thought that was really beautiful.
Thank you so much, Arne Tunstall, for joining us for this dancing conversation. Next up, we're going to watch an excerpt from Pioneer Winter's work, Reprise. This originally premiered in 2018, and this filmed clip version is from 2019. That was a series of excerpts from Pioneer Winter's Reprise from 2018 and 19. And next up to continue our conversation, I am delighted to introduce Tony Pancush. Tony Pancush is an archives assistant at the Drs. Nicholas and Dorothy Cummings Center for the History of Psychology at the University of Akron. Their work includes researching and designing exhibitions and educational programming, as well as leading the Cummings Center's accessibility and inclusion initiatives. They earned their BA in History from the University of Akron and their Master of Library and Information Science from Kent State University. They are a historian of LGBTQ+ identity and expression in popular media and the social sciences. In 2020, they wrote and designed the Cummings Center's online exhibition, A Clockwork Lavender, Sexology, Psychology, and the LGBTQ+ community, which explores the overlapping narratives of research and protest in the history of LGBTQ+ psychology. Currently, they are serving as co-chair of the American Alliance of Museums LGBTQ+ Alliance Task Force for Transgender Inclusion, which works to support trans inclusion in museums through advocacy, content, policy review, and resource development. Tony, thank you so much for taking our invitation to dance. Thank you.
Of course, thank you for having me. It's such an honor.
Oh, fantastic. And we're going to talk a little bit about Clockwork Lavender. But before we get to that, I'm really curious, what are you seeing or noticing when you watch Pioneer's film clips?
So what really stood out to me in Reprise are these sort of dual themes of very vocal and sort of militant action and speaking out, as well as this theme of uplift, a very literal community uplift happening in that second portion of the video. So to begin with, we have this sort of back and forth call and response happening between these two figures. And what you're really seeing is something almost being lost in translation between the two, right? There's this increasingly loud yelling for response, and none of the responses that the first figure seems to get back really seem to quite satisfy what it is that they actually need or want. And what I see in that really is sort of a parallel in a lot of LGBTQ+ history, and a lot of the histories of marginalized peoples in general, where you see marginalized folks, calling out towards those in power and those in positions of privilege and asking for specific things, radical change that can actually improve their lives. And what you get back is maybe a more moderate version of that, or sort of a watered down response, or
if you get a response,
or no response at all. Exactly,
Yes.
Exactly. And so I saw that parallel that we see so much in queer history in that first portion of the video. And then in the second portion that we see, it kind of shifts, and you see these folks in sort of the matching sequined costumes, and you really get a sense of community, even though I think the sort of atmosphere of the video is still a little bit ominous and a little bit dark. You see these folks still coming together in a very literal sense and lifting each other up and supporting each other in their community. And so when I think about these ideas kind of in conversation, what I really see is this narrative of marginalized peoples reaching out for assistance and maybe not getting that assistance from those in power, and instead having to turn inward and support each other and look out for each other through acts of community and acts of service to each other.
That is such an astute observation, because I think that knowing that this is a part of Pioneer's history and past in his dance work, then his approach to support the individuality in Birds of Paradise, and how this has become not just a COVID compromise, but a focus on individual stories and a series of solos, is a natural extension after having that group community uplift that you noted in earlier works.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So speaking of work that's all related to each other, A Clockwork Lavender, what from that research came up for you in watching and engaging with these dance clips?
Well, when you talk about sort of vocal resistance to those in power, and particularly this idea of movement as social movement. So A Clockwork Lavender is all about the history of psychology and the field of sexology in relation to the LGBTQ+ community. And that history is built upon social movements and vocal resistance from the very beginning. So if you go back to the beginning of these fields, right, in the sort of late 19th century, so the modern idea of these fields, LGBTQ plus identity is not studied as identity. It's studied as behavior, and specifically as criminal behavior. So right from the beginning, you have these sexologists who are writing these works and sort of condemning LGBTQ folks, and you have actual queer folks who are reaching out and saying, this is not an accurate representation of who we are. These are biased samples that you're drawing off of. Here, actually talk to us, see who we are as people. And you get a little bit of change there. You get some change from individuals. For example, a fellow named Richard von Krafft-Ebing was one of the major sort of early sexologists. And he actually, you can see in his works over decades, goes from comparing queer folks to sort of the degeneration of nations and sort of these perversities to actually writing in opposition to the German laws that criminalized homosexuality. So you see this sort of nudging in the right direction, but as a whole, the fields don't really move in response to that. So then we kind of fast forward to the 20th century, and those same themes are still playing out. So you have these decades of research that have been built up by the folks like Kinsey or Evelyn Hooker, who are proving that there's nothing inherently perverse or degenerate about queer folks. This previous research is inherently false, but the actual establishment is not acting on these sort of individual voices. What actually pushes for the depathologization of LGBTQ plus identity, beginning in the 1970s, are community actions, communities coming together at the conventions of the American Psychiatric Association and the American Psychological Association to actively resist and hold these massive protests with sort of guerrilla drag shows and things of that nature. So it's that vocal opposition. It's that coming together, uplifting each other, and putting each other's careers or your own career on the line in a way to reach out and support those around you, that really creates change, that really gathers that response that is being sought after.
There's so much inside of that about inside of queer movements is an inherent performance in order to be heard.
Absolutely, yes.
I love that connection, and I wanted to offer the invitation in another form of movement, and that is migration, because our earlier talks, you acknowledged that queer migration has been an ongoing theme in a lot of your work and research. So because that is about physical movement, what would you like to share with us about that?
Yeah, so I grew up in New Philadelphia, Ohio, which is about an hour south of Akron. Not a huge distance necessarily, but it's sort of a very small city, a more rural environment. And I really struggled to find anything approaching a sense of queer community in that space. It was the actual act of moving to Akron, moving into a more urban environment, that allowed me to feel more comfortable in my own identity and to actually come out, first as gay and now as sort of a queer, non-binary trans person. And so the physical act of migration really played a major role in my own queer identity and my queer self-discovery. And visits to other cities since then have also influenced how I see myself as a person. And that's not uncommon. You see this in a lot of queer folk stories in both modern day and also throughout history. Historians George Chauncey and David K. Johnson have done amazing work on the histories of New York and Washington, D.C., respectively, as these rapidly growing urban centers that attracted queer individuals because they offer the chance to reinvent themselves, to transform, that theme that we saw earlier tonight, to really sort of reinvent themselves in an entirely new space. When you see rapid urban growth and the chance to participate in the development of a new space, queer people enthusiastically take up that opportunity because it's a means of escape. It's a means of escaping sort of these inhospitable environments that they might be sort of languishing or feeling trapped in. And you see that in the history of the American West as well. The historian Peter Boeck has done some amazing work on trans and gender nonconforming folks in the American West. When sort of frontier opened up for folks to move west, a lot of trans and gender nonconforming people hopped at that opportunity because it was a chance to leave their previous cisgender identities behind and really become something new in a space where no one would recognize them, where no one would hold this past sort of against them or hold them up to this version of themselves that no longer exists.
Tony, thank you so much for joining us tonight, because we are so grateful that you are a part of the Akron community too. So
well, thank you. It's an honor to be here.
Thank you. All right. And we have a couple more thank yous to our community that make all of this programming possible. And I'd like to first offer an extended thank you to Tonda, Arne, Tony, and Pioneer for joining us this evening. And then we also would like to extend a special thank you to our funders. Public programs and events like these are made possible with additional support by the National Endowment for the Arts, Ohio Arts Council, the GAR Foundation, and the Akron Community Foundation. In addition, the establishment and general operation of NCCAkron is made possible by the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation. And finally, we'd love to also invite you to stay engaged with us, to follow Pioneer's work and all of the work of our speakers this evening. And so Pioneer, as long as health continues and we are able to safely travel, will be joining us with his dancers this December 2021 here in Akron. And we'll be reimagining Birds of Paradise for some of our gallery spaces here on campus, so that you can stay tuned with opportunities to possibly experience this work live and continue the conversation with these artists. Join our mailing list at NCCAkron, AKRON.org. Thank you very much, and good night.